The gunshot that shattered the morning calm wasn't what made Josephine Newton freeze on the dusty street of Carlin, Nevada, but rather the sight of her father crumpling to his knees outside the general store, blood spreading across his shoulder like spilled wine. She dropped the basket of eggs she'd been carrying and ran toward him, her cotton dress kicking up clouds of desert dust as 3 men on horseback circled the scene. The tallest rider, Malcolm Crawford, sat astride his black stallion with the casual arrogance of a man who knew no consequence would touch him. His dark eyes fixed on Josephine as she knelt beside her wounded father, and the smile that crossed his face made her skin crawl. "Should have thought twice before refusing my offer, Newton," Malcolm said, his voice carrying the educated drawl of a man raised back east but corrupted by frontier greed. "I wanted to buy your land proper-like, but you had to be stubborn about it." Josephine's father, Henry Newton, clutched his bleeding shoulder and spat into the dirt. "That land's been in my family since '49. Ain't selling it to a snake like you, Crawford, not for any price." Malcolm's companions, 2 rough-looking men who clearly drew pay for their guns rather than honest work, laughed at that. Malcolm himself remained still, his hand resting casually on the pearl handle of his revolver. "See, that's where you're wrong, Henry. You're going to sign over that deed, one way or another. I've got plans for that creek running through your property, and I don't take kindly to obstacles." "Pa, we need to get you to Doc Morrison," Josephine said, trying to help her father stand. At 22 years old, she'd seen her share of trouble in this Nevada mining town, but Malcolm Crawford represented something darker than the usual claim jumpers and card cheats. He'd arrived in Carlin 6 months ago with money, muscle, and ambitions that seemed to grow more dangerous by the week. "Not so fast, Miss Newton." Malcolm dismounted with practiced ease, his expensive boots landing softly in the street. He was handsome in a cold, calculated way, with features that might have graced a gentleman's portrait back in Boston or Philadelphia. "Your father's situation presents us all with an opportunity to resolve this unfortunate conflict." "Get away from us," Josephine said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. She'd learned early that showing weakness in a place like Carlin was an invitation for predators. Malcolm ignored her, addressing Henry instead. "Here's my new offer, Newton. You sign over your land and I'll pay for the finest doctor in Virginia City to tend that shoulder. Refuse, and next time my aim won't be quite so merciful." He paused, his eyes sliding back to Josephine. "Or, there's a third option. I've been thinking I need a wife to make my new house presentable. Your daughter would suit that purpose admirably. Marry her to me, and you can keep your land. I'll even throw in enough money to make your ranch profitable again." The words hung in the hot Nevada air like a death sentence. Josephine felt her father tense beside her, and she knew without looking that he was struggling between pain, rage, and the terrible mathematics of their situation. The Newton Ranch had been failing for 2 years, ever since a drought had killed most of their cattle. They owed money to the bank, money to the feed store, and her mother's medicine before she'd passed last winter had drained what little savings they'd had. Malcolm Crawford knew all of this, of course. Men like him made it their business to know where weakness lived. "Go to hell," Henry managed, though his voice was weakening from blood loss. Malcolm shrugged, his hand moving toward his gun again. "Have it your way." "Boys, I think we need to make our point a little more permanently. Hold it right there." The voice came from behind Josephine, deep and calm with an authority that didn't need volume to command attention. She turned to see a cowboy she'd noticed around town over the past few weeks. A tall man in his mid-20s with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a winter sky. He wore the practical clothes of someone who worked for a living, dusty denim, and a worn leather vest, a revolver sitting easy on his hip in a way that suggested real familiarity with its use. Malcolm's expression shifted from annoyance to something more calculating. "This isn't your concern, stranger. Ride on before you get hurt." "Name's Thomas Dalton," the cowboy said, moving to stand between Malcolm's men and the Newtons. "And I'm making it my concern." Shooting an unarmed man in the street and threatening a woman strikes me as the kind of thing that needs intervention. One of Malcolm's hired guns, a scarred man with tobacco-stained teeth, laughed. "You fixing to take on all three of us, cowboy? That's suicide." Thomas's expression didn't change. "I'm fixing to see justice done. There's a difference." His eyes never left Malcolm. "I know who you are, Crawford. Word travels from town to town, and your reputation precedes you. You've been running roughshod over folks from here to Carson City, buying up land and water rights, hurting anyone who won't sell. But that stops today, at least in Carlin." A crowd had begun to gather, townspeople emerging from shops and homes to witness the confrontation. Josephine recognized familiar faces. Mrs. Chen from the laundry, old Sheriff Winters who was too tired and too bought off to be much use anymore, the Reverend Patterson from the church, and a dozen others. They watched with the helpless hunger of people who'd seen too many injustices but lacked the courage or means to stop them. Malcolm seemed to recognize this too. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You make some bold accusations, Dalton, but I see no law here willing to back your play." "Sheriff, do you have any complaints about my conduct?" Sheriff Winters, a man in his 60s who looked every day of it, shook his head slowly. "Crawford's been a model citizen, far as I can see. Pays his bills, causes no trouble." "No trouble except putting a bullet in Henry Newton," Thomas said, his voice hardening. "That's attempted murder, last I checked." "A misunderstanding," Malcolm said smoothly. "I fired a warning shot and Mr. Newton unfortunately moved into its path. I'll even pay his medical expenses to demonstrate my goodwill." His eyes glittered with malice. "As for my marriage proposal, that stands. Miss Newton can accept my courtship of her own free will, and will consider this entire matter closed." "I'd sooner marry a rattlesnake," Josephine heard herself say, the words coming out before she could stop them. Malcolm's face went cold. "Careful, girl. You're in no position to insult me." "She's not marrying you," Thomas said, and something in his tone made everyone look at him. "She's marrying me." The street went silent except for the wind rattling a loose shutter somewhere and the distant sound of the stamp mill processing ore. Josephine stared at Thomas Dalton, this stranger who just upended her entire world with 4 words. Malcolm's expression shifted through surprise, anger, and then calculation. "Is that so?" Malcolm said softly. "And does Miss Newton have a say in who she marries, or are you no better than me, claiming her like property?" Thomas finally looked at Josephine, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not ownership or entitlement, but a question and a promise wrapped together. "Miss Newton can speak for herself, but if she agrees, I'll stand by the claim. She's spoken for, Crawford." "Find yourself another target for your schemes." Josephine's mind raced. She knew nothing about Thomas Dalton, except what she'd observed over the past few weeks. He worked at the Miller Ranch east of town, kept to himself mostly, paid cash for his meals and supplies, and treated people with a quiet respect that was rare in rough places like Carlin. He'd never spoken to her directly before, though she'd caught him looking at her once or twice with an expression she couldn't quite read. Now he was offering her a way out of an impossible situation, and she had perhaps 3 seconds to decide if she was brave enough to take it. She looked at her father, pale and bleeding. She looked at Malcolm Crawford, who watched her with the predatory patience of a cat at a mouse hole. She looked at the townspeople, their faces showing everything from pity to relief that someone was finally standing up to Crawford. Then she looked back at Thomas Dalton and made her choice. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying across the silent street. "I'm marrying Thomas Dalton, not you, Mr. Crawford, not ever." Malcolm's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might draw his gun and end all of them right there in the street. But too many witnesses watched now, and even his bought-off sheriff couldn't ignore a massacre in broad daylight. Instead, he smiled, though it looked more like a wolf baring its teeth. "Congratulations," he said, his voice like honey over broken glass. "I hope you'll both be very happy. But this conversation about the Newton land isn't over, not by a long stretch. You see, Dalton, you just made yourself part of this problem, and I solve problems permanently." He mounted his horse in one smooth motion, his men following suit. "Enjoy your engagement. I suspect it'll be a short one." They rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving the street full of murmuring townspeople and two people who just agreed to marry without having exchanged more than a dozen words. Josephine felt the reality of what she'd done settling over her like a heavy blanket, but there was no time to process it. Her father needed help. "Doc Morrison's place," Thomas said, already moving to help support Henry. "Can you manage if I take his other side?" Together they got her father to his feet and began the slow walk down the street to the doctor's office. Henry drifted in and out of consciousness, and Josephine found herself grateful for Thomas's steady presence on the other side. Doc Morrison, a competent man who'd seen his share of gunshot wounds in 40 years on the frontier, took one look and ushered them inside. "Get him on the table," Doc said, already rolling up his sleeves. "This going to be trouble with Crawford, or can I report this as an accident?" "Report it however keeps you safe," Thomas said. "Crawford's not someone to cross without preparation." "And you just crossed him pretty thoroughly," Doc observed, probing Henry's wound with practiced fingers. "Bullet went clean through, missed the bone. He'll heal, but it's going to take time." He looked at Josephine. "You got somewhere safe to stay. Crawford strikes me as the type to hold a grudge." "She'll stay with me," Thomas said, then immediately corrected himself. "I mean, there's a boarding house run by Mrs. Fletcher. She's respectable, won't stand for any trouble. I'll make sure Miss Newton has a room there until we can sort things out properly." Josephine finally found her voice. "Mr. Dalton, I appreciate what you did out there, but we should talk about what happens next. You can't just announce we're getting married and expect me to go along with it without discussion." "You're right," Thomas said, meeting her eyes. "I apologize for the presumption. Truth is, I spoke without thinking, just saw you in trouble and reacted. We need to talk, somewhere private, once your father's settled." An hour later, Henry Newton was resting under Doc Morrison's care, cleaned and bandaged and dosed with enough laudanum to keep him sleeping peacefully. Josephine sat with him until she was certain he was stable, then stepped outside to find Thomas waiting in the shade of the doctor's porch, his hat in his hands. "There's a cafe 2 streets over," he said. "Mrs. Patterson's place. We could talk there, public enough to be proper but quiet enough for real conversation." She nodded, and they walked through the afternoon heat of Carlin, past the assay office and the hardware store, past miners heading for the saloons and merchants closing up for the day. The cafe was indeed quiet, just a few customers lingering over coffee. Mrs. Patterson, the Reverend's wife, greeted them with knowing eyes but said nothing except to bring them coffee and give them a corner table. For a long moment neither spoke. Josephine studied Thomas Dalton more carefully now that she had the chance. He was handsome in an unpolished way, with strong features and calloused hands that wrapped around his coffee cup with surprising gentleness. His eyes, when they met hers, held intelligence and something else, sadness, maybe, or old pain carefully locked away. "I should explain myself," Thomas began. "What I did today might seem crazy or presumptuous, and maybe it was both. But I couldn't stand by and watch Crawford force you into something against your will." "Why?" Josephine asked simply. "You don't know me. You could have been killed or at least made yourself a target for a dangerous man. Why risk that for strangers?" Thomas turned his coffee cup in his hands, considering his words. "I knew a girl once, back in Texas. This was 5 years ago when I was working a ranch down near San Antonio. Her name was Margaret, and she was the daughter of a rancher who'd fallen on hard times. There was a man, wealthy and connected, who wanted to marry her. He wasn't quite as obvious a villain as Crawford, but he wasn't kind either. Margaret didn't want to marry him, but her family needed the money, and she felt she had no choice." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I was just a ranch hand with nothing to offer, so I kept my mouth shut. Figured it wasn't my place to interfere. She married him, and within a year she was dead. He claimed it was pneumonia, but the rumors said otherwise." "I'm sorry," Josephine said, and meant it. "I swore after that I'd never stand by again if I saw someone being forced into a bad situation. When Crawford started in on you today, all I could think was, not again, not if I can help it." He looked at her directly. "But I also need to be clear about something. When I said you were marrying me, it was to protect you. I don't expect you to actually go through with it. We can let folks think we're engaged for a while, long enough for Crawford to lose interest or for you to find a real solution. Then we can quietly call it off." Josephine sipped her coffee, thinking. And what if Crawford doesn't lose interest? From what I know of him, he's not the type to give up easily. He wants our land because of the creek, and he wants me because I said no. Men like that don't take rejection well. "Then we'll figure something else out," Thomas said. "But I won't trap you in a marriage you don't want. You have my word on that." "What if," Josephine said slowly, working through an idea as she spoke, "what if we actually did get married? Hear me out," she added, seeing his surprise. "Not a real marriage, not at first. But a legal one, enough to protect my father's land and get Crawford off our backs. We could live separately, keep things proper, and if it doesn't work we can get it annulled later. But married, I'd have your protection and you'd have legal standing to help defend the ranch." Thomas leaned back in his chair, studying her. "That's a big risk for you. You'd be tying yourself to a man you don't know, staking your future on a stranger's character." "I'm already at risk," Josephine pointed out. "Crawford will come after us whether you're in the picture or not. At least this way I'd have someone standing beside me instead of facing it alone. My father is a good man, but he's getting older, and now he's wounded. I need help, Mr. Dalton, and you seem to be offering it." "Thomas," he said, "if we're discussing marriage, even a practical one, you should call me Thomas." "Josephine," she replied, "or Joe if you prefer." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they were contemplating settling between them. Finally, Thomas spoke. "I need you to know what you'd be getting. I'm not a wealthy man. I work for wages, save what I can, and send money back to my mother in Texas. She's been poorly since my father died, and she's got my 2 younger sisters to care for. I'm 26 years old, I can read and write. I don't drink to excess, and I've never hit a woman or child. I'm good with horses and cattle, and I'm told I'm honest to a fault." He smiled slightly. "Not much of a resume for a husband, but it's the truth of who I am." "That's more honesty than most courtships get," Josephine said. "And for what it's worth, here's my truth. I'm 22, educated by my mother who was a school teacher before she married. I can cook, so manage accounts, and shoot a rifle well enough to bring down game when we need it. My father taught me everything about running a ranch, though we haven't had the money to run it properly in years. I'm stubborn. I have a temper when provoked, and I don't suffer fools gladly." She met his eyes. Also not much of a resume for a wife, but there it is. Thomas smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger and less careworn. "Sounds to me like we might actually manage to help each other out, Josephine Newton." "So we're really doing this?" she asked. "Getting married to spite Malcolm Crawford and save a failing ranch." "I've heard of worse reasons for matrimony," Thomas said. "At least we're being honest with each other from the start. That's more than most couples can say." They shook hands across the table, sealing their unlikely agreement. Mrs. Patterson, watching from behind the counter, allowed herself a small smile. News of the arrangement would be all over Carlin by sunset, but that was probably for the best. The more public their engagement, the harder it would be for Crawford to challenge it. Over the next week, Thomas proved himself to be a man of his word. He arranged for Josephine to stay at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house, paying for a month's room in advance. He visited Henry Newton daily at Doc Morrison's office, bringing books and conversation to pass the healing time. And he began spending his evenings at the Newton Ranch, assessing what needed to be done to make it functional again. The ranch sat 5 miles east of Carlin, a collection of weathered buildings nestled against the foothills where a creek provided precious water in the desert landscape. It had been beautiful once, Josephine told him, back when her grandfather had claimed it in '49 during the California gold rush. He'd chosen to stay in Nevada instead, raising cattle and horses for the mining camps. Her father had inherited it and built it up further, but drought, debt, and bad luck had worn it down to almost nothing. Thomas walked the property with a rancher's eye, noting what could be saved and what was beyond hope. The main house needed repairs, but the structure was sound. The barn had a sagging roof that would need replacing before winter. The corrals could be mended. And the creek, that precious creek that Crawford coveted, ran clear and constant even in the height of summer. "It's good land," Thomas told Josephine one evening as they sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the sun paint the desert in shades of orange and purple. "With work and investment, it could support a decent herd again. I can see why Crawford wants it." "My grandfather used to say this was the best piece of land in Nevada," Josephine said, her voice wistful. "He'd be heartbroken to see what's become of it." "What's become of it is temporary," Thomas said. "With your permission, I'd like to start making repairs. I've got some savings, enough to buy materials and maybe hire a hand or two. Once we're married, the ranch will be legally protected. Crawford can't force your father to sell if the deed's in your name and you're married to someone who won't be intimidated." Josephine looked at him in the fading light. Over the past week, she'd come to appreciate Thomas Dalton's quiet competence and steady presence. He did what he said he'd do, treated her with respect, and never presumed anything beyond their agreement. She'd caught herself watching him sometimes, noticing the way he moved with unself-conscious grace, the way he listened when she spoke as if her words actually mattered. It confused her, these small sparks of awareness. This was supposed to be a practical arrangement, not a real marriage. She shouldn't be noticing the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, or how safe she felt when he was nearby. "Thomas," she said carefully, "you've been so generous already, I can't ask you to spend your savings on our ranch. You're not asking, I'm offering." He turned to face her. "Joe, I know this started as a convenient fiction to protect you from Crawford. But the more time I spend here, the more I think it could be something real. Not just a business arrangement, but an actual partnership. You need help saving this ranch, and I need—" he paused, searching for words. "I need a purpose beyond just drawing wages and sending money home. I need to build something to matter somewhere. Maybe we could do that together." Before Josephine could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them both stand. 3 riders emerged from the twilight, and even at a distance she recognized Malcolm Crawford's distinctive black stallion. Thomas's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, then stopped. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. Malcolm and his men rode right up to the porch, their horses snorting and stamping. In the week since the confrontation in town, Josephine had heard rumors about Crawford's expanding ambitions. He'd bought out 2 more struggling ranches and was now the largest landowner in the county. His power was growing and his patience with obstacles was shrinking. "Cozy little scene," Malcolm observed, his eyes moving between Thomas and Josephine. "Playing house already before the wedding? That seems premature." "State your business, Crawford," Thomas said evenly. "This is private property." "Actually, that's what I came to discuss." Malcolm pulled a document from his coat. "I've filed a claim with the land office in Carson City, alleging that Henry Newton's original deed has irregularities. Apparently there was some confusion about survey boundaries back in '52, and the land he claimed might actually belong to the federal government. Of course, I'm prepared to purchase the disputed territory at a fair price, once the matter's resolved." Josephine felt her heart sink. She'd heard of this tactic before, wealthy men manufacturing legal troubles to dispossess small landowners who couldn't afford lawyers or lengthy court battles. "That's a lie. My grandfather's deed was properly filed and recorded. You're inventing problems to steal our land." "That's a serious accusation, Miss Newton," Malcolm said coldly. "I'm simply following proper legal channels. If your deed is legitimate, you have nothing to worry about." Of course, these investigations can take months or even years, and during that time, all property improvements and income streams are frozen. You wouldn't be able to sell cattle, make repairs, or take out loans against the land. He smiled. "That could be difficult for a family that's already drowning in debt." "Get off this property," Thomas said, his voice hard as iron, "and don't come back." Malcolm's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "You're making a mistake, Dalton. You're just a hired hand playing at being a rancher. This fight is bigger than you and it'll crush you if you're not careful. I'm offering you a chance to walk away. Take it. Not interested." "Pity." Malcolm turned his horse, his men following suit. "Oh, and congratulations on your upcoming wedding. I heard you're planning it for this Sunday. I'll be sure to attend. I do enjoy a good ceremony." He rode off into the gathering darkness, leaving behind a sense of threat that felt almost physical. Josephine found herself shaking with anger and fear. "He's not going to stop. He'll tie us up in legal problems until we're bankrupt, and then he'll take the land anyway." "Maybe," Thomas said, "but he's also making mistakes. He's showing his hand too clearly, making his intentions obvious." "That might work for us." He was thinking, she could see it in his face. "We need to get married sooner than Sunday. Tomorrow, if Reverend Patterson will do it. Once we're legally wed, I can start taking measures to protect the ranch that you can't do as an unmarried woman. And we need to send word to Carson City, find a lawyer who can fight Crawford's claim. That takes money we don't have." "I have some," Thomas said. "And I know people, other ranchers and business owners who are tired of Crawford pushing everyone around. If we can organize them, present a united front, we might have a chance." They spent the evening making plans, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Josephine felt a glimmer of hope. Thomas was methodical and thorough, thinking through contingencies and alternatives. He rode back into town that night to speak with Reverend Patterson about moving up the wedding, and to begin quietly reaching out to potential allies. The next day, barely an hour after dawn, Josephine stood in the small Carlin church, wearing her mother's wedding dress, which she'd altered to fit. The ceremony was simple and quick. witnessed by Doc Morrison, Mrs. Fletcher, and a handful of townspeople who'd proven themselves trustworthy. Her father, still too weak to leave his bed at Doc's office, had given his blessing the night before with tears in his eyes. "Do you, Thomas Dalton, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Patterson intoned. "I do," Thomas said, his voice steady. "And do you, Josephine Newton, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Josephine looked at Thomas, this man who'd become her unexpected champion. In the morning light streaming through the church windows, he looked both strong and gentle, his eyes meeting hers with complete honesty. "I do," she said, and meant it more than she'd expected. They signed the papers, making it legal and binding. Thomas Dalton and Josephine Dalton, husband and wife. When the Reverend pronounced them married and suggested Thomas could kiss his bride, there was an awkward moment where neither knew quite what to do. Then Thomas smiled slightly, leaned in and pressed a gentle, respectful kiss to Josephine's lips. It was brief, almost chaste, but Josephine felt it through her entire body like a spark of electricity. The gathering at Doc Morrison's office afterwards served as their wedding celebration, though Henry Newton's pale face and obvious pain put a damper on any festivity. Still, he managed to shake Thomas's hand and welcome him to the family officially. "Take care of her," Henry said, his voice rough with emotion and laudanum. "She's all I've got left in this world." "I will," Thomas promised, "and we'll save your ranch, sir, I give you my word." The legal marriage changed things immediately. Thomas moved his few belongings from the bunkhouse at the Miller Ranch to the Newton property, taking up residence in the barn to maintain propriety since Josephine was staying in the main house. He gave notice to his employer, who understood and wished him well. And he began the work of fortifying their position. First, he rode to Carson City himself, a 2-day trip each way, to file counter documents with the land office and retain a lawyer named Samuel Fisher, who had a reputation for integrity and skill. Fisher agreed to take the case for a reduced fee, intrigued by the challenge of taking on Crawford. While Thomas was gone, Josephine wasn't idle. She rode into Carlin and began her own quiet campaign, visiting the families and businesses that had suffered under Crawford's expanding influence. The Chen family, who ran the laundry, had nearly lost their business when Crawford bought the building and tripled their rent. The Hendersons, whose small ranch bordered Crawford's new holdings, had lost cattle to suspicious raids. The Morneau family's mining claim had been challenged by Crawford's lawyers. The list went on, a litany of injustices that had gone unanswered because no one had the resources or courage to fight back. "What if we stood together?" Josephine asked them, one by one. "What if we pooled our knowledge, our evidence, our resources? Crawford's been picking us off individually, but united we'd be harder to destroy." The idea took root slowly, like seeds in hard ground. People were scared, and rightfully so. But they were also angry, and desperation had a way of breeding courage. By the time Thomas returned from Carson City, Josephine had quietly organized a coalition of 20 families and business owners, all willing to stand witness to Crawford's abuses and support each other against his predations. Thomas was impressed and told her so. "You've done in 3 days what might have taken me months," he said, studying the list of names she'd compiled. "This is good. This is exactly what we need." They held their first meeting in the church basement, a gathering that had to be kept secret for fear of Crawford's retaliation. Reverend Patterson, a braver man than his elderly sheriff, agreed to host and even spoke passionately about the moral necessity of standing against corruption and bullying. This town was built by decent people seeking honest opportunity, the Reverend said to the assembled group. We can't let one man's greed destroy what generations have built. The Daltons are taking a stand, and I believe we should stand with them. They formed what they called the Carlin Citizens Association, with Thomas as their reluctant leader and Josephine as secretary, documenting everything. They collected evidence, sworn statements, and records of Crawford's various schemes. Samuel Fisher, the lawyer from Carson City, agreed to represent the group collectively, which spread the legal fees across multiple families and made it affordable. Crawford's response was swift and vicious. Within a week of the association's formation, Thomas was jumped by 3 men on his way back from town one evening. They left him beaten and bloody by the side of the road with a warning: back off or next time would be worse. Josephine found him stumbling toward the ranch house just after dark, helped him inside, and spent the night cleaning his wounds and trying not to cry with frustration and fear. "We should stop," she said as she pressed a cloth to the cut over his eye. "This is too dangerous. It's not worth dying for." Thomas caught her hand, holding it gently. "Joe, if we stop now, everything we've worked for is lost. Your ranch, your father's legacy, the hope of everyone in that association, all gone. Crawford wins, and he'll be emboldened to do worse to the next person who crosses him." His split lip made speaking painful, but he pushed on. "I knew this would be dangerous when I started. I'm not backing down." "You could be killed," Josephine said, and realized she was crying despite her efforts not to. "Thomas, I don't want to lose you." He looked at her with something like wonder. "I thought this was just a practical arrangement, convenient protection, nothing more." Josephine realized she was still holding his hand. Over the past weeks, something had shifted between them without her quite noticing when or how. The man who'd been a stranger had become a partner, then a friend, and now something more complicated that she was afraid to name. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, to the sound of his voice and the steady reliability of his character. The thought of him being hurt or worse made her chest tight with an emotion that went far beyond gratitude or respect. "Maybe it started that way," she admitted quietly. "But it's not just practical anymore, at least not for me." Thomas reached up with his free hand to gently wipe a tear from her cheek. "Good," he said softly, "because I've been half in love with you since the day I watched you face down Crawford in the street without flinching. And I've been all the way in love with you since the night we planned this fight together on your porch, and I saw the fire in your eyes when you talked about saving your family's legacy." They sat in the lamplight of the ranch house kitchen, bruised and weary and scared, and Josephine leaned forward to kiss him properly for the first time. It was different from the brief ceremonial kiss in the church, deeper, real, full of promise and fear and need. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "We're really married," Josephine said, as if realizing it for the first time. "We are," Thomas agreed. "Is that all right?" "Yes," she said, and kissed him again to prove it. The fight with Crawford intensified over the following weeks. The Citizens Association filed formal complaints with the territorial governor's office. Crawford retaliated by calling in loans and raising prices at the businesses he controlled. Samuel Fisher presented evidence of fraud and intimidation to a circuit judge. Crawford's lawyers filed counter motions and challenges. It became a war of attrition, each side probing for weakness, testing resolve. Through it all, Thomas and Josephine worked side by side, their partnership strengthening into something unbreakable. Thomas repaired the ranch buildings, working dawn to dusk to make the property functional again. Josephine managed the books, coordinated the Citizens Association, and cared for her father as he slowly healed. At night, they'd collapse exhausted, but they'd talk for hours, sharing stories of their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Thomas told her about growing up in Texas, about the hardscrabble life of a ranch hand, about the weight of being the oldest son and needing to support his family after his father's death. Josephine told him about her mother's illness, about watching the ranch decline despite her father's best efforts, about the loneliness of being the only child of aging parents in a harsh land. "I used to wonder if I'd end up alone," Josephine confessed one night as they sat on the porch, watching stars emerge in the vast Nevada sky. "Everyone my age either left for California or married young. I was too busy helping my parents to think about courtship. And then suddenly, I was 22 and all the available men were either prospectors passing through or Malcolm Crawford types," Thomas finished. "Exactly. Men who saw a struggling ranch and a woman without protection and thought they could take advantage." She leaned against his shoulder, a gesture that had become natural between them. "Then you showed up and turned my whole world sideways." "Same," Thomas said, wrapping an arm around her. "I'd convinced myself I'd just work and save and never have anything of my own. That I'd send money home until my sisters were grown and my mother passed, and then I'd be too old to start a real life. But this ranch, this community we're building, this feels like something worth fighting for. Like I matter in a way I never did before." "You matter," Josephine said firmly. "To me, to my father, to everyone in the association. You stood up when no one else would, Thomas. That's not nothing." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen, the laundry woman, had a cousin who worked as a clerk in the Territorial Land Office in Carson City. This cousin, looking through records for Samuel Fisher's investigation, discovered that Crawford's own land claims had irregularities, serious ones. Several of his purchases had been made through intimidation and coercion, with forced signatures and fraudulent witnesses. Moreover, Crawford had been claiming water rights that legally belonged to the government, selling access to water he didn't own. Armed with this information, Samuel Fisher filed criminal charges against Crawford with the territorial authorities. It was a risky move, since Crawford had connections and money to fight back. But the evidence was damning, and the territorial governor, facing pressure from multiple sources, agreed to launch a formal investigation. Crawford's response was to escalate to violence. 2 members of the Citizens Association had their homes burned. Another was beaten so badly he'd never walk right again. The message was clear: back off or face worse. The association met in emergency session in the church basement, fear and anger filling the cramped space. Some wanted to give up, to accept whatever terms Crawford offered just to make the violence stop. Others wanted to arm themselves and fight back directly. The meeting was on the verge of falling apart when Josephine stood up. "Listen to me," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too. My husband comes home bloody, my father still can't lift his arm properly, and every night I wonder if Crawford's men will burn our house down while we sleep. But here's what I know: if we quit now, we're finished. Not just our fight, but our dignity, our futures, everything. Crawford will own this town and everyone in it, and he'll keep squeezing until there's nothing left." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. "My husband asked me a few weeks ago what the ranch meant to me. I told him it was my grandfather's legacy, my father's life work, the only home I've ever known. But it's more than that. It's proof that ordinary people can build something lasting in a hard land. It's proof that we don't have to let bullies and thieves win just because they're strong. And if we give up now, what are we telling our children? That justice doesn't matter. That cowards prosper and the brave get crushed. Easy to talk about being brave when you've got Thomas Dalton standing beside you," someone called out. "Not all of us have a gunfighter for a husband." "Thomas isn't a gunfighter," Josephine shot back. "He's a ranch hand who got brave one day in the street because he saw an injustice and couldn't stand by. That's all any of us need to be brave for one moment, then another, then another. We don't have to win all at once. We just have to not quit." Reverend Patterson stood up beside her. "Miss Josephine is right. The Lord calls us to stand against wickedness, not to cower before it. I propose we continue our fight, but we do it smart. We document everything, we stay united, and we trust in the law and in Providence to see us through." The vote was close, but in the end, the association agreed to continue. They implemented new security measures, traveling in groups and keeping watch on vulnerable properties. Thomas taught several of the men basic defensive tactics. Josephine organized a schedule so that no one was ever truly alone and vulnerable. The territorial investigation proceeded slowly, as such things did, but momentum was building. A federal marshal arrived in Carlin to interview witnesses and examine evidence. Newspapers in Virginia City and even Sacramento picked up the story, framing it as honest citizens standing up to a land baron. Public opinion, that nebulous but powerful force, began to turn against Crawford. Cornered and desperate, Crawford made his final move. He showed up at the Newton Ranch one evening with a dozen armed men, more force than he'd ever shown before. Thomas and Josephine were in the barn when they heard the horses. Thomas grabbed his rifle, positioning himself between the approaching men and the house. "Dalton," Crawford called out. "I'm done playing games. You've got one last chance. Take your wife and leave this county. I'll pay you $5,000 for your trouble and you can start over somewhere else. Stay, and I'll bury you both." Thomas stepped out of the barn, rifle held ready but not aimed. "You don't have a dozen men worth of courage, Crawford. Need that much backup to threaten one ranch hand and his wife." "I have the force necessary to solve my problem," Crawford replied. His earlier polish was gone, replaced by raw aggression. He was a cornered animal now, his schemes unraveling, his reputation crumbling. "This is your last chance, Dalton. Take the money and go." "No," Thomas said simply, Crawford's face twisted with rage. "Then you'll die here, all of you." "I'll claim self-defense, say you fired first, and there's not a witness alive who will contradict my 12 men." "13," called a voice from the darkness. A rider emerged, then another, then more. Members of the Citizens Association, armed and determined, forming a line behind Thomas and Josephine. They'd been watching, waiting, ready to help when needed. Within minutes, Crawford's dozen men faced more than 30 citizens of Carlin, and the odds had shifted dramatically. 14, added Sheriff Winters, riding up with his deputy. The old lawman looked more alive than he had in years. "Federal marshals in town, Crawford, with warrants for your arrest. Fraud, intimidation, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. You're done." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Crawford's hand dropped toward his gun, and the world erupted in violence. Shots rang out, powder smoke filling the air, men shouting and horses screaming. The fight lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. When the smoke cleared, Crawford lay dead in the dirt, along with 2 of his men. 3 more were wounded and surrendered. The rest had fled into the night. Thomas had taken a bullet in his side, and Josephine was at his side instantly, pressing cloth against the wound to stop the bleeding. "You're all right," she kept saying, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. "You're going to be all right." "Is it over?" Thomas managed through gritted teeth. Sheriff Winters surveyed the carnage and nodded. "It's over." Crawford drew first. "We've got 3 dozen witnesses. Federal marshal will clean up the rest." He looked at Thomas with something like respect. "You did good, son. This town owes you." They got Thomas to Doc Morrison, who extracted the bullet and pronounced him lucky it had missed everything vital and would heal clean. Henry Newton, recovered enough now to move around, sat with his son-in-law through the night while Josephine dozed fitfully in a chair, exhausted beyond measure. Over the following weeks, Crawford's empire collapsed. His properties were seized to pay debts and restitution to his victims. The land office in Carson City invalidated his fraudulent claims and restored proper ownership to those he displaced. The Newton Ranch deed was confirmed as legitimate, with all challenges dismissed. The Citizens Association dissolved, its purpose fulfilled, but the connections forged during the crisis remained. Carlin had changed, become a community willing to stand together rather than just a collection of isolated individuals trying to survive. Thomas recovered fully, though he bore a scar on his side that Josephine would trace with her fingers on quiet nights, a reminder of how close she'd come to losing him. They threw themselves into rebuilding the ranch, and with Thomas's management and Josephine's business sense, it began to prosper again. They purchased cattle, hired 2 hands to help with the work, and even bought out a neighboring property that had belonged to one of Crawford's shell companies. Henry Newton, his health finally returning, moved back to the ranch house but insisted on building a small cottage on the property for himself. "You two are married," he said firmly. "You need privacy to build your own life. I'll be close enough to help but far enough to stay out of your way." The cottage was completed by late autumn, and Henry moved in with obvious relief and contentment. He'd come to love Thomas like the son he'd never had, and he took joy in watching the young couple bring his family's ranch back to life. Winter came to Nevada, cold and harsh but beautiful in its own way. Thomas and Josephine settled into the rhythms of married life, working together through the days and warming each other through the long nights. Their practical arrangement had transformed into something deep and true, a partnership of equals built on respect, trust, and love that had grown from the most unlikely beginnings. One evening in December, as they sat before the fire in their ranch house, Josephine told Thomas the news she'd been holding close for a week. "I saw Doc Morrison yesterday," she said, taking his hand. "I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby." Thomas's face went through surprise, joy, and wonder in quick succession. "A baby," he repeated as if testing the words. Then he laughed and pulled her into an embrace. "We're going to be parents. Joe, I don't even have words." "Scared?" she asked, knowing she was. "Terrified," he admitted. "And happier than I've ever been." Both at once. They held each other in the firelight, contemplating the future they were building together. Their child would grow up on this ranch, would run through these fields and drink from this creek, would carry on the legacy that had nearly been lost. It felt right, like pieces finally falling into place. The baby arrived in late June, a son they named James Henry Dalton after Josephine's father. Henry Newton wept when they told him, and he doted on his grandson with shameless devotion. The boy was healthy and strong, with his father's eyes and his mother's determination. Thomas proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle but firm when needed. Josephine watched him with their son and fell in love with him all over again, seeing new dimensions to the man who'd become her everything. The ranch continued to prosper. Within 3 years, they'd paid off all the debts and were turning a profit. They added more land, more cattle, built a proper bunkhouse for their growing number of employees. The Newton Dalton Ranch, as it came to be known, became one of the most successful operations in the county. Josephine's involvement in the Citizens Association had given her a taste for civic engagement. She started a school in Carlin, serving as teacher herself until they could afford to hire one. She organized a library, a women's cooperative, and a system of support for families in need. Thomas served on the town council and helped recruit a new sheriff after Winters finally retired. They had more children, 3 more over the following years. A daughter named Mary, another son called William, and finally another daughter they named Clara after Thomas's mother, who'd passed peacefully in her sleep back in Texas. The house rang with laughter and noise, with the chaos and joy of a large family. Henry Newton lived to see all his grandchildren, finally passing quietly at the age of 72 with Thomas and Josephine at his bedside. He died content, knowing his legacy was secure and his daughter was loved. Years became decades. James grew up to take over management of the ranch, showing his father's skill with animals and his mother's head for business. Mary became a teacher, carrying on her mother's commitment to education. William went east to college and returned as a lawyer, serving the community as Samuel Fisher had once served them. Clara, the youngest, had her mother's fire and determination, and became involved in the women's suffrage movement, fighting for rights and justice just as her parents had fought against Crawford. Thomas's hair went silver, and Josephine's face showed the lines of years spent in the harsh Nevada sun, but they remained devoted to each other. On quiet evenings, they'd sit on their porch, the same porch where they'd first planned their resistance all those years ago, and talk about the improbable journey that had brought them together. You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't spoken up that day in town? Josephine asked one such evening, her hand in his as the sun set over their land. Thomas considered the question. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but mostly I just feel grateful. Crawford was a monster, but he gave me a reason to be brave. And that one moment of courage led to everything good in my life, you, our children, this ranch, this community. I'd live through it all again, every dangerous moment for this." Josephine leaned her head on his shoulder. "I was so angry at first, you know. This stranger announcing I was marrying him like he had the right to decide my future. But you weren't trying to control me. You were giving me a choice, offering an alternative when I had none. That's the difference between you and Crawford. He tried to take what he wanted by force. You offered help and let me decide if I wanted to accept it. Best decision I ever made," Thomas said, kissing the top of her head. "Though announcing it in the middle of the street probably wasn't my most subtle approach," she laughed. "Subtle or not, it worked. You rode in like something out of a dime novel and saved me from the villain. Very romantic, actually." "Only because the real story came after," Thomas said. "The actual work of building a life together, learning to trust each other, choosing to love each other every day, that's the real romance." The dramatic rescue was just the beginning. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Their children and grandchildren were scattered now, living their own lives but always coming home for holidays and celebrations. The ranch thrived under James's management. The town of Carlin had grown and prospered, no longer under anyone's thumb. The wild, lawless edge of the frontier was softening as civilization spread, bringing both benefits and losses. But here on their porch, with the man who'd become her entire world, Josephine felt completely at peace. The scared young woman who'd faced Malcolm Crawford in the street seemed like someone from another lifetime. The desperate stranger who'd made a wild gamble on a marriage of convenience was barely recognizable in the confident matriarch surrounded by family and respect. Thomas squeezed her hand. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How lucky I am," Josephine said simply. "How lucky we both are. That you were brave enough to speak up, that I was brave enough to say yes, that we survived everything that came after. So much could have gone wrong, but somehow it all went right." "Not luck," Thomas said. "We made it right. Together." As stars began to emerge in the vast Nevada sky, they went inside to the warm, lamp-lit comfort of the home they'd built together. The house was full of memories now, every corner and floorboard holding stories of births and celebrations, of hard times weathered and victories won. It was a house transformed by love from a failing legacy into a thriving future. That night, lying in bed with Thomas's arm around her, Josephine reflected on the extraordinary path her life had taken. She'd been forced toward a marriage with a cruel man, and a cowboy had spoken up and changed everything. But the real story wasn't in that single dramatic moment. It was in all the moments that followed. The hard work and harder choices, the fears faced and overcome, the trust built slowly over time, the friendship that deepened into partnership that blossomed into love. Their story had started with a lie, a convenient fiction to protect her from Crawford's schemes. But they'd transformed that lie into truth, word by word and day by day, until the marriage that began as strategy became the realest thing in both their lives. Josephine fell asleep in her husband's arms, grateful beyond measure for the cowboy who'd spoken up, for the courage to accept his help, and for every day of the life they'd built together. Outside, the Nevada night was vast and star-filled, the desert alive with possibility, and on the Newton-Dalton ranch, love endured as strong as the day it first took root in the dusty streets of Carlin, that day when everything changed because one man decided to be brave and one woman decided to trust him. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Thomas and Josephine celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and half the town of Carlin. It was a joyous affair, held at the ranch with tables groaning under the weight of food and music playing late into the night. People spoke of the Daltons with respect and affection, remembering how they'd stood up to corruption and saved not just their own land but the whole community's independence. As they grew older, Thomas and Josephine gradually handed over daily operations of the ranch to James and his wife, though neither could quite step away entirely. Thomas still rose early to check on the horses, and Josephine still kept meticulous books of accounts. But they made time now for things they'd been too busy for in their younger years. Long rides through their property, visits to their scattered children, quiet afternoons reading together on the porch. Their love had only deepened with time, seasoned by shared trials and countless small kindnesses. They knew each other completely now, could communicate with a look or touch, finished each other's sentences and thoughts. What had started as a desperate gamble had become the surest, strongest thing in either of their lives. On their 40th anniversary, a reporter from the Virginia City newspaper came to interview them about their role in breaking up Malcolm Crawford's criminal empire. The story had become something of a legend in Nevada, part of the narrative of how the wild frontier became civilized society. "What would you say was the key to defeating Crawford?" the reporter asked, pencil poised over notebook. Thomas and Josephine exchanged a look, the kind of wordless communication that came from decades of partnership. "Community," Thomas said finally. Crawford thought he could pick people off one by one, that everyone would be too scared or too weak to fight back. But when folks came together, supported each other, stood as one, he didn't have a chance. "And courage," Josephine added. It took courage for Thomas to speak up that first day in the street. Took courage for everyone in the Citizens Association to stand against Crawford despite the risks. Sometimes you just have to decide that some things are worth fighting for, and then you fight. The article ran with a romantic slant. "Cowboy's courage sparks 40 years of true love." Thomas groaned when he read it, embarrassed by the flowery language, but Josephine laughed and clipped it carefully. adding it to the scrapbook she'd kept over the years. Their children had given them 14 grandchildren, and those grandchildren were beginning to marry and have children of their own. The ranch that had nearly been lost now supported 3 generations, with plans being made for a 4th. The name Newton Dalton meant something in Nevada, stood for integrity and hard work and standing up for what was right. Thomas was 70 when his health began to fail. Not dramatically, but in the slow way of a body that had worked hard for decades and was finally wearing out. He moved more slowly, tired more easily, but his mind remained sharp, and his love for Josephine never wavered. She nursed him through the bad days and celebrated with him on the good ones, their roles reversed from those early days when she tended his wounds after Crawford's beatings. On a warm spring evening in their 62nd year of marriage, Thomas and Josephine sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and red. The ranch hummed with activity around them, the sounds of family and purpose, of life continuing. No regrets. Josephine asked, as she sometimes did. Not a single one, Thomas replied, as he always did. He took her hand, the gesture as natural as breathing after all these years. You gave me a life worth living, Joe, a family, a home, a purpose, everything that matters. You gave me the same, she said softly. Plus you saved me from Crawford, can't forget that part, he smiled. I just gave you an option, you were brave enough to take it. We were brave together, she corrected. That's what made it work. They watched the sun disappear below the horizon, comfortable in each other's presence. Somewhere in the house, grandchildren were laughing. In the barn, James was settling the horses for the night. The creek that had caused so much trouble decades ago babbled contentedly, watering the land that had been worth fighting for. Thomas passed peacefully in his sleep 2 months later, Josephine holding his hand. He was 71 years old, had lived a good life, and left behind a legacy of love and integrity that would echo through generations. The funeral was attended by hundreds, a testament to the respect he'd earned and the lives he'd touched. Josephine grieved deeply, but not bitterly. They'd had more than 6 decades together, more than most couples could dream of. She'd been loved completely by a good man, had built a life and family that brought joy and meaning. The pain of losing him was real and sharp, but it was the flip side of having had something precious worth mourning. She lived another 5 years, long enough to see her first great-great-grandchild born. She spent her final years surrounded by family, telling stories of the old days, of Crawford and the Citizens Association, of how a cowboy had spoken up in the street and changed her entire world. The young ones listened with wide eyes, finding it hard to imagine their tiny, silver-haired great-grandmother as the brave young woman who'd stood up to a villain. When Josephine passed at 79, she was buried beside Thomas on a hill overlooking their ranch, the place they'd both loved and fought for. Her children and grandchildren gathered to say goodbye, sharing memories and tears and laughter. She'd lived to see the 20th century arrive, had witnessed the wild frontier transform into established civilization, had raised a family that honored the values she and Thomas had embodied. The Newton Dalton Ranch continued to thrive, passing from James to his children and onward through the generations. The story of how it had been saved became family legend, retold at gatherings and celebrations. The young woman forced toward marriage with a cruel man, and the cowboy who spoke up and said she was marrying him instead. It became a romance for the ages, a tale of courage and love and standing against injustice. But for those who lived it, Thomas and Josephine, it had been simpler and more profound than any legend could capture. It had been 2 people choosing each other day after day, building something real from desperate beginnings, transforming a strategic fiction into the truest thing in their lives. Their graves on the hill overlooked the ranch that had been worth saving, the land that had been worth fighting for, the legacy that would endure long after their names faded from memory. And if the wind whispered through the Nevada desert on quiet evenings, carrying echoes of old promises and enduring love, well, perhaps some things were too powerful to be confined to just one lifetime. Perhaps the love they'd built continued somehow, in the land they'd saved, and the family they'd created, and the courage they'd inspired in others to stand up and fight for what was right. The ranch house still stood, modernized and expanded, but recognizably the same structure where Thomas and Josephine had planned their resistance, raised their children, and grown old together. The creek still ran clear and constant. The desert still bloomed in spring with surprising color. And somewhere in the foundation of it all, built into the very bones of the place, was the love story that had started with a stranger's courage and a desperate woman's trust, and had flourished into something that defined not just two lives but an entire legacy. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth holding close as an example of what two people could build together when they chose love over fear, courage over safety, and partnership over solitude. It was the story of they were forcing her to marry a cruel man. The cowboy spoke up and said, "She's marrying me." And then they made that improbable claim into beautiful, lasting truth that endured long after the frontier had faded and the Wild West had become history. Their love remained, carved into the land, woven into family memory, proof that sometimes the most romantic stories are the ones where people simply choose each other, and then do the hard work of making that choice matter every single day thereafter.